far left in the United States is being fed through Cuban subversion and Chinese money. Money from China and infiltration from Cuban intelligence networks. And that's a big deal. Why is that? It's because a lot of these organizations can be now defunded. A lot of these organizations, key leaders of it, can be deported because a lot of them are actually foreign actors. A lot of people can be arrested, actually, if they want to go that far. The communist movement in America got very careless, and the element of foreign influence within their ranks could be the thread to unwind them. It's a very big point on this. Now, Marco Rubio also makes a key point about Cuba, which the State Department's now moving on very heavily. They came out with this big report. They're taking immediate action. It does seem to be the case that Cuba has been playing a large role in the communist movement here that has been basically flying under the radar for a very long time. And what you're seeing now with the reestablishment of the Monroe Doctrine, or the Donroe Doctrine as Trump calls it, throughout Latin America, the political shifts taking place throughout Latin America, the defunding of the NGOs and other kind of nonprofits that were doing a lot of foreign aid using American money, that's actually a big picture too, because these organizations were political powers throughout Latin America and a lot of the world. This is not talked about often. The defunding of these organizations actually does have a political impact. And I can say this directly because I've witnessed it with my own two eyes, and I've talked to people who've told me about it in governments in Latin America. I'll give you one brief example of this. When I was in Panama, if you haven't seen my documentary I did called Weapons of Mass Migration, where I went to the Darien Gap and I interviewed, in the video you might have seen, I interviewed the leader of Senafront, or the former leader at this point, but still a government official, right? The former leader of Senafront, in his sit-down interview with me, said, and Senafront is like Panama's police/military, kind of plays both roles. The leader of Senafront said, the United Nations and NGOs are basically presenting a political power shift within Panama. They're challenging the government's sovereignty to the extent that they're worried about maintaining their sovereignty. He and others told me that many of these NGOs were even backing political candidates to undermine, they believed, their own laws, including taking away rights and power from their own military and police. The head of Senafront told me this. For example, and one of the big reasons was, on that front, Senafront ran a lot of the migrant camps and in the kind of the processing facilities, and the NGOs were trying to seize control of that because they wanted to kind of run the show on the mass migration system, right? Which is through a United Nations project called the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration. If you want to watch more on that, watch my documentary. Again, Weapons of Mass Migration. Why does this matter? It's because these organizations, they were basically taking government money from the U.S., doing the bare minimum of their actual jobs we paid them to do, and then they were carrying on options for other interests, including international, globalist, or even foreign interests like China and so on. These organizations were acting against the interests of the United States. That's the basis on which Trump has defunded them. They've now moved a lot of the funding under the State Department. So the State Department is doing U.S. aid directly, and also doing it in a way that only reflects American interest. That is what Marco Rubio himself has come out to say in terms of how it's shifted in terms of how America does foreign aid. And so as you've seen these organizations get defunded, a lot of the oil in the system for the radical left has been basically pulled out. And also the rejection of China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba, very importantly, throughout Latin America, is creating a political shift throughout the entire region. That's why this matters. And so now that there's hyper-focus on Cuba, that's a big deal on two fronts. One is because of the massive role they've played within the United States. The other is because of the massive foreign role they play. The Cuban communist regime, through its intelligence networks, runs a global narrative talking about the global South. If you hear politicians talk about global South, they've been influenced by Cuban intelligence because it's a phrase from the Cuban communist ideology. And they also talk about third worldism, basically framing America and the West as the evil imperialists trying to conquer everything. and the global South as being, the good guys fighting against the evil, white people is how they frame it effectively. That's a Cuban communist narrative, one that has played a very heavy role in the American left, and one that has also played a role in radicalizing a lot of movements throughout Latin America, Africa, and Asia, and the Middle East. And so now that this is being dismantled, it plays that role, but also something else, which is Cuban intelligence was also infiltrating militaries and governments throughout Latin America and criminal circles. The cartels, many of the drug organizations in Latin America were created through a Chinese program run under Mao Zedong, but went through Cuba as a proxy. So Mao went to Cuba, Castro used his intel networks to create the networks for the drugs. Cuba is kind of the keystone. You pull that out, the whole thing falls down. Cuba taking out their power in terms of the ability to carry out this subversion will crumble a lot of the communist movement and a lot of the criminality, actually, too, within Latin America, and by extension also within the United States. Getting that element out is going to be a huge thing. And so, to that point, when Marco Rubio is talking about America will never be communist and these organizations are not going to work and they're not going to have their revolution, he's also accompanying that with direct.
I hate this.